There is a huge amount of unrecorded human history beneath the ocean surface that we don't know very much about at all.
It started as a routine job. A team of salvage divers was scanning the seabed near the ruins of Knossos. They expected to find car parts or maybe an old fishing boat. Instead, their sonar pinged back something massive and rectangular. It was a man-made structure buried in the sand. When they finally got inside, they realized the room was sealed for a reason.
Definitely, they don't look natural. It was an amazing find.
The markings on the walls were not just art, they were a desperate plea. And get this, the translation suggests they were not afraid of the water. They were afraid of something else. The dive that changed history. The water off the coast of Crete is usually crystal clear, a beautiful turquoise that hides a lot of secrets. For years, tourists have swum right over the top of history without even realizing it. But for a team of salvage divers looking for scrap metal, this was just another day at the office. They were scanning an area near the ancient site of Knossos, a place famous for myths about monsters and labyrinths. They were not looking for history, they were looking for profit. But here is the catch. The ocean had other plans. About 30 feet down, buried under layers of shifting sand, their equipment picked up a hard, straight line. Nature does not make straight lines. Rocks are round and jagged. This was perfect, geometric, and massive. The divers went down to investigate, expecting maybe a lost shipping container or a piece of a modern boat. What they found was stone, massive blocks of limestone, fitted together so tightly you could not slide a credit card between them. It was a wall, and it was leading to something big. They spent hours clearing away the sediment. As the sand drifted away in the current, a structure emerged from the gloom. It looked like a small room or a storage unit distinct from the surrounding natural reef. But the crazy part is the entrance. It was blocked by a massive slab, sealed with a type of ancient mortar that had somehow survived thousands of years of saltwater corrosion. This was not a ruin that had fallen apart. This was a time capsule. Scholars generally agree that the coastline of Crete has changed a lot over the last 4,000 years. Earthquakes have pushed land up and dropped other parts into the sea. But finding a fully intact, sealed chamber this far out was unheard of. It implies that the ground dropped violently and instantly, taking this building with it before it could crumble. The divers managed to work a camera probe through a small crack in the masonry. The feed that came back to the boat was grainy, but it was enough to make everyone go silent. The room was empty of sand. It was dry, or at least it had been until the crack formed. Inside there were jars, stone tables, and something else. The walls. They were covered in inscriptions. This creates a massive problem for historians. We know the Minoans, the people who lived here, were advanced. They had paved roads and running water when most of the world was living in mud huts. But we thought we had found all their major sites. Finding a sealed room underwater implies there is a whole layer of this civilization we have missed. It suggests a city or a port that was swallowed whole in a single afternoon. The location is key here. It is right in the shadow of the Palace of Knossos. This was the headquarters of the oldest city in Europe. If this chamber is connected to the palace, it could hold the records of the kings who ruled the Mediterranean. But it is not that simple, though. The markings on the wall do not look like a royal decree. They look rushed. They look like a panicked note. The divers knew they had to report this. You do not just bust into a 3,000-year-old room without telling the government. But the initial images sparked a firestorm. Why was this room sealed from the outside? Who locks a room before the city sinks? And most importantly, what were they trying to keep safe? Or maybe, what were they trying to keep inside? As news of the find reached the surface, experts began to scramble. They realized this could be the missing link. The evidence suggests that whoever built this knew the water was coming. They were trying to preserve something vital. The divers were just looking for scrap, but they stumbled onto a crime scene from the Bronze Age, and the victim was an entire civilization. The divers were about to open the door, but they had no idea that the air inside might still be toxic after 3,000 years. What the Minoans were hiding. When marine archaeologists finally got a clear look at the walls inside the chamber, they were confused. They expected to see art. The Minoans were famous for their beautiful frescoes of bulls, dolphins, and people jumping over animals. Their art was colorful and full of life. But the walls of this sunken chamber were different. There were no pretty pictures, just rows and rows of scratched symbols. It looked like linear A. That is the name scholars gave to the writing system used by the ancient Minoans. Here is the deal with linear A. We still cannot read most of it. It is one of the biggest mysteries in archaeology. We can read linear B, which came later and is an early form of Greek. But linear A is a ghost language. It belongs to a people who disappeared and they took the key to their language with them. However, the markings in this chamber were unique. They were deep and jagged, carved into the stone with a heavy hand. It was not the neat, careful writing of a scribe. It was the writing of someone who was terrified. Even without knowing the words, the scholars could feel the emotion. The symbols were large and erratic. Based on similar symbols found on pottery, experts believe the text is a list, but not a grocery list. It looks like an inventory of losses. Some symbols resemble the sign for grain, ships, and water, but they are repeated over and over, crossed out, or circled. It paints a picture of a society that was falling apart. What most people don't realize is just how smart these people were. The Minoans were not primitive. In the Palace of Knossos, just a few miles away from this underwater site, they had flushing toilets. They had a complex drainage system that was better than anything in Europe until the 1800s. They built structures 4 stories high that were designed to withstand earthquakes. They were the masters of the ocean. Their navy controlled trade from Egypt to Italy. So, seeing them panic is unsettling. It would be like walking into a modern bunker and finding equations scribbled on the wall by a genius who realized the math didn't add up. The chamber contained stone chests. Inside were not gold or jewels, but tablets. Clay tablets that had been fired, likely by the heat of a massive fire that happened before the water rose. These tablets are the real treasure. They seem to detail the final days of the port. They mention a shaking earth and the Great Cloud. This lines up perfectly with one of the most violent events in human history, but we will get to that in a minute. The really shocking part is that the writing suggests they were betrayed. The symbols for brother and enemy are mixed together. This has led to a wild theory. Maybe the Minoans didn't just die from a natural disaster. Maybe they were taken out from the inside. The chamber seems to be a safe house or a vault. Someone was trying to hide the truth about what was happening to their kingdom. The layout of the room supports this. It wasn't a temple, it was a secure storage unit. The walls are thick and the door was designed to be hard to find. It is almost like a black box on an airplane. It was designed to survive the crash so that people in the future would know what happened. The discovery of this black box changes our view of the Minoans. We usually think of them as peaceful traders who loved flowers and sports. But this room shows a darker side, a side full of fear, paranoia, and preparation for the end. The markings imply they had technology or knowledge they were desperate to save. Some scholars even think the ships mentioned on the wall were not trade ships, but evacuation vessels. They were packing up. They knew the end was near, but they ran out of time. The seal on the door was wet when it was set. That means the water was already lapping at their feet when they closed it. They locked the truth inside and left it for the ocean to protect. The writing on the wall spoke of a great wave, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer size of the monster approaching their shores. Why the chamber was buried. To understand why this chamber was sealed and buried, we have to look north. About 70 miles away from Crete sits the island of Santorini. Today, it is a beautiful tourist trap with white houses and blue roofs, but 3,600 years ago, it was a ticking time bomb. It was known as Thera, and it was home to a massive volcano. Around 1600 BC, that volcano blew its top, and that is putting it mildly. It was one of the biggest volcanic explosions in the last 10,000 years. It was 4 times bigger than Krakatoa. It blasted a hole in the earth so big that the ocean rushed in to fill it. This is not just a story. We can see the ash layer in the soil all over the Mediterranean. The explosion would have turned day into night. Ash would have fallen like snow on Crete, choking the crops and poisoning the water. But the ash was not the main killer. The collapse of the volcano into the sea created a tsunami. And this was not a normal wave. Computer models suggest the wave that hit Crete was over 100 feet tall. That is as high as a 10-story building. Imagine a wall of water that high, moving at the speed of a jet plane. It would have smashed into the north coast of Crete with the force of a nuclear bomb. This explains the underwater chamber perfectly. The wave would have stripped the coast bare. It would have smashed ships, leveled harbors, and dragged buildings deep into the sea. The sealed chamber the divers found was likely part of a larger complex that stood on dry land. When the wave hit, the ground liquefied. The building sank and the sediment covered it up, preserving it like a bug in amber. The markings inside the chamber mentioned the Great Cloud. That was the ash plume. They saw it coming. They felt the earthquakes, the shaking earth, days or weeks before the big explosion. They knew something terrible was happening. The priests probably tried to pray to the gods, but the engineers and scribes tried to save the data. This disaster was the beginning of the end. The Minoan civilization was built on sea power. Their navy was their strength. But you cannot have a navy if your ports are destroyed and your ships are smashed against the mountains. The wave wiped out their fleet in seconds. Archaeologists have found evidence of fire destruction all over Crete from this time period. For a long time, they thought it was an invasion. But now it looks like a mix of earthquake damage, fires from overturned lamps, and the chaos that follows a disaster. The sealed chamber offers a snapshot of those final moments. It creates a terrifying picture. The sky is black. The ground is shaking so hard you cannot stand up. And on the horizon, a white line appears. It gets bigger and taller until it blocks out the little light that is left. The person inside the chamber slapped the mortar on the door, hoping the stone would hold. Then everything went dark. This event broke the back of the Minoan people. They survived the wave, but they were weak. Their trade networks were gone. Their crops were dead. And that is when the wolves came to the door. But the connection to the volcano brings up another huge question. Is this the story that started the biggest legend of all time? The destruction was absolute. But the memory of a great island sinking into the sea sounds suspiciously like a story we have all heard before. A legend born from ash. Whenever someone finds a sunken ruin, the A word comes up. Atlantis. Most serious scientists roll their eyes when they hear it, but here is the crazy part. The connection between the Minoans and Atlantis is actually pretty strong. The Greek philosopher Plato is the guy who wrote down the story of Atlantis. He said it was a mighty naval power that lived on an island. He said they had advanced engineering, palaces with running water, and they worshipped bulls. Does that sound familiar? The Minoans were a mighty naval power. They lived on an island, they had running water, and they were obsessed with bulls. You see bull horns on every temple and fresco in Knossos. The mechanical labyrinth theory. When we look at the ruins of Knossos today, we see a palace. We see throne rooms, courtyards, and storage magazines. But for centuries, the locals whispered about something else. They whispered about the labyrinth. According to the legend, King Minos hired the ultimate inventor, Daedalus, to build a maze so complex that once you went in, you never came out. Its purpose was to hold the Minotaur. But archaeologists have dug up every inch of Knossos, and they have never found a maze. There are no winding corridors that lead to nowhere. There is no dungeon. This has led to a wild, game-changing theory that connects directly to the underwater discovery. What if the labyrinth wasn't a building? What if it was a machine? The new sonar scans of the underwater structure show something that has engineers scratching their heads. The walls of the sealed chamber are not just solid stone, they are hollow in specific places. Inside these hollows, the scans detected traces of lead and copper lining. You do not line a wall with copper to hold up a roof. You do it to conduct something. Maybe water, maybe sound, or maybe something we don't fully understand yet. This leads us to the hydraulic computer theory. We know the Minoans were obsessed with water. They had pressure systems that rival modern plumbing. Some fringe researchers believe that the labyrinth was actually a massive underground hydraulic system designed to stabilize the island against earthquakes. Think about it, Crete is right on a fault line. It gets shook all the time. If you were a civilization that was smart enough to build 4-story earthquake-proof towers, maybe you tried to solve the earthquake problem at the source. The underwater room might be a control valve or a pressure release station. The theory suggests that Daedalus designed a system of massive underground cisterns and tunnels. By moving water around deep underground, they could dampen the vibrations of the Earth. It sounds like science fiction, but the principles are actually used today in massive skyscrapers. We use giant dampeners to stop buildings from swaying. The Minoans might have been trying to stop the ground itself from moving. This changes the meaning of the roaring bull. In the myths, the Minotaur would roar from beneath the earth, shaking the ground. Historians usually say this was just a metaphor for earthquakes. But if this machinery theory holds water, the roar wasn't a monster. It was the sound of thousands of gallons of water rushing through stone pipes under high pressure. It was the sound of the machine working. The sealed chamber that the divers found might contain the blueprints for this technology. The panic depicted on the walls wasn't just because of the volcano, it was because the machine had failed. When the volcano on Thera erupted, the shockwave was too big for the system to handle. The labyrinth didn't just break, it backfired. Imagine the scene. The engineers are in this coastal facility. The gauges, whatever they look like, are redlining. The pressure in the underground tunnels is building up to a critical point. They know that if they don't seal off this section, the feedback loop will tear the island apart. They aren't locking a door to keep thieves out. They are sealing a breach in a high-pressure system. The tablets found inside might not be religious texts. They could be technical manuals. They could be the Bronze Age equivalent of a code-red logbook. If this is true, it means the Minoans were centuries, maybe millennia, ahead of where we thought they were. It implies they had a grasp of geology and physics that was lost when their civilization collapsed. This theory also explains why the Greeks, who came later, were so afraid of this place. They found the ruins of these massive pipes and gears, or whatever remained, and they didn't understand what they were looking at. To a primitive shepherd, a rumbling, hissing, copper-lined tunnel doesn't look like a machine. It looks like the throat of a monster. They created the myth of the Minotaur to explain the terrifying technology they found in the wreckage. But it gets deeper. Some scans of the surrounding seabed show straight lines extending out from the chamber for miles. These look like conduits. If the Minoans were tapping into geothermal energy or using hydropower on a massive scale, this underwater site was the power plant. The sealed chamber is the reactor core, and they sealed it because it was leaking something dangerous. This brings us to the weirdest anomaly of all. The marine life around this specific structure is different. Divers reported that fish seem to avoid the immediate area of the sealed door. There is a circle of dead silence around it. It suggests that whatever is inside that room is still active, or at least still emitting a frequency or a substance that nature instinctively fears. The machine might have been turned off 3,000 years ago, but the battery hasn't run out yet. The Patient Zero Protocol. If the machine theory feels too industrial, there is a biological theory that is arguably even more terrifying. This theory focuses on the Minotaur legend again, but from a medical perspective. We have to ask ourselves, why did the divers feel such a sense of dread? And why does the translation on the wall confuse enemy with brother? The wild theory here is that the Minoans were dealing with a biological threat. A plague. In the ancient world, plagues were common, but the legends of Crete are specific. They talk about a curse that required human sacrifice. The story says that Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women every year to be devoured by the Minotaur. Historians say this was a tax or a tribute, but let's look at it through the lens of a quarantine. What if the sealed chamber wasn't a bunker for people, but a vault for a pathogen? The Minoans were master traders. Their ships went everywhere: Egypt, Turkey, Italy, maybe even further. When you trade goods, you trade germs. Some researchers speculate that one of their ships brought back something horrific, a virus or a bacteria that the isolated islanders had no immunity to. The Minotaur wasn't a bullman. It was a visible symptom of the disease. Maybe it caused deformities or growths or madness that made people act like animals. The labyrinth was a quarantine zone, a complex isolation ward designed to keep the infected away from the healthy population. Now look at the underwater room again. It was sealed with mortar. That is an airtight seal. You don't make a room airtight to store grain. You make it airtight to stop air from getting out. The panic in the inscriptions might be the panic of a medical team realizing they have lost containment. The wild part of this theory suggests that the Minoans were trying to cure it. They were advanced. They did brain surgery. We have found skulls with healed drill holes to prove it. They knew about medicine. The tablets inside the chamber might be medical records. They might be the formula for a cure or the documentation of their failure. The connection to the volcano makes this even darker. Some geologists speculate that deep earth tremors can release pockets of ancient toxic gases or bacteria trapped in the rock. When the earthquake started before the eruption, maybe they cracked open something that should have stayed buried. The plague came from the earth itself. The divers found jars in the room. Standard archaeology says these are for olive oil or wine, but the sonar density scans show that the residue inside these jars is unusually heavy. It contains high concentrations of organic material that hasn't decayed in the same way as normal food. The terrifying possibility is that these jars contain samples. They were freezing the virus, or at least sealing it away in the most secure container they had, hoping that future generations might find a way to kill it. The sacrifice of the youth from Athens might have been an attempt to find someone with natural immunity. They weren't feeding a monster. They were looking for antibodies. This puts the betrayal mentioned on the walls in a new light. Brother mixed with enemy. This happens in civil unrest. If the ruling class was hiding a plague in a secret facility while the city was falling apart, the people would have revolted. The scribes inside the room were not just hiding from the water, they were hiding from a mob. The mob wanted to burn the place down, not realizing that burning it would release the sickness. Now imagine the scene for a second. The ground is shaking. The sky is turning black from the ash of the Santorini eruption. Everyone else in the city is panicking, grabbing their kids, and running for high ground. They know the water is pulling back and they know the big wave is coming. But there is a small group of people who aren't running. These aren't just regular citizens. These are the high priests, or maybe even the top scientists of their time. They are standing in front of this massive reinforced facility. They know the tsunami is going to wipe them out. They know they have zero chance of survival. But they made the ultimate call. They stayed behind to do one last job. They chose to bury the facility. They spent those final precious minutes sealing the door. They poured molten lead into the cracks. They hammered in the locking pins. They sealed themselves outside just to make sure that whatever was inside never got out. They knew they were about to drown, but they accepted it. Why? Because they had to ensure the Minotaur drowned with them. This theory flips everything we know about the Minotaur legend on its head. We always picture a monster, a half-man, half-bull beast running around a maze. But what if the labyrinth wasn't a maze of hallways? What if it was a complex ventilation system, a quarantine zone, and the Minotaur wasn't a beast you could fight with a sword? What if the Minotaur was a disease? This suggests that the ocean didn't just destroy the Minoan civilization, it actually saved the rest of the world. Think about it. If that massive wave hadn't hit, what would have happened? Eventually, looters, rioters, or desperate refugees might have broken into that facility looking for food or gold. If they had cracked that seal, the Bronze Age collapse might not have been caused by wars or famine. It might have been caused by a global pandemic that humanity wasn't ready for. That brings us to the divers off the coast of Crete today. They think they are just looking at ruins, but they might be hovering right on top of a biological time capsule. If they manage to crack that seal open, they aren't just opening a dusty old room. They are effectively popping the lid off a petri dish that has been fermenting in the dark for 3,000 years. It gives a whole new, terrifying meaning to the phrase, curse of the mummy. Usually we think of curses as magic or superstition, but this isn't magic. It's biology. It's germs. And it perfectly explains why the ancient texts explicitly mention a fear of something other than the water. They weren't afraid of the drowning. They were afraid of the invisible fire they had locked inside. Now I know what you're thinking. These theories sound like they belong in a sci-fi movie. They are definitely out there on the fringe, but you have to look at the physical evidence. Look at the way the door was sealed. It wasn't built to keep thieves out, it was built to keep something in. The airtight seal, the warnings carved into the rock, the layout that looks way more like a hazard bunker than a religious temple. You have to admit, the standard story doesn't quite fit. The Minoans were hiding a secret big enough that they were willing to let their entire civilization be buried under the sea just to keep it contained. Whether it was some kind of ancient machine that could shake the earth or a biological bug that could wipe out humanity, they wanted it to stay lost forever. And for 3,000 years, nature obliged. The ocean kept the lid on the jar. But now we are knocking on the door and we might not like what answers. So here is the question that keeps scholars up at night. If a civilization as advanced as the Minoans could vanish overnight, leaving only a few warnings in a sealed room, what makes us think we are immune to the same fate? Are we ignoring the signs just like they did? If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe for more historical mysteries.